Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to people like you. With us today on the program, we got to talk to Caleb Maupin. He is an author as well as a contributor in many facets in media, and he is a advocate of socialism as well as Marxism. And we had a conversation today really diving through his reactions to the 2020 election, as well as, generally dissecting these terms that are loaded for a lot of people of socialism and Marxism, and frankly, where these left-leaning movements go. There's a lot of these causes that I am empathetic with. Obviously, this is part of the reason why we are the Hill of Roses. We are generally social democratic, and that welcomes some socialist elements. And there are some elements that I'm not as, comfortable with socialism. And we had a nice conversation to try and come to a common understanding of what, that balance is between a truly fully public society versus a little bit more of a mixed economy in general. So I had a great time being able to learn from Caleb today. I know you're going to enjoy it too. So with no further ado, let's get into it. Okay, we're here with Caleb Maupin. We are here to have a conversation today, giving some reflection on the nature of the progressive movement, different factions within it to try and come to a common understanding and where we go from here now that the 2020 election is largely seeming resolved for the most part. So Caleb, before we get into this, I've given the folks out there a little bit of an introduction for yourself, but could you let them out there know a little bit more about yourself and, where you've come into play for politics currently?
Well, I'm a journalist and political analyst. I'm very opposed to the system of monopoly capitalism, in which a few big corporations dominate the globe and keep countries around the world in chronic poverty. I consider myself to be from the Marxist tradition and an advocate of 21st century socialism. I think that China, Venezuela, and other socialist countries play a very progressive role, and that's how I come at things.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you first and foremost, obviously, as I mentioned, we're doing reflections now where the state of American politics is after the election. How are you feeling with the results? Obviously, a lot of people would, in mainstream conversation, say that the left wing of America won, the Democratic Party won. Do you see that alignment with the Democratic Party? Do you consider that a victory for the causes that you want to champion?
Well, I'm certainly not in favor of Trump's policies. I think he's been very problematic, especially the way he handled this pandemic, especially the way he's handled a lot of international situations. But at the same time, let's remember that before we, jump up and applaud for the Democrats and make it sound like this is just such an epic victory, let's remember that there was a pandemic that was mishandled. The economy is in a crisis. There is media constantly telling the public that Donald Trump is a traitor and an ally of, foreign regimes or something. And with all of that, the Democrats still managed to just squeak through. And in all of that, the Democrats had a situation where Donald Trump is still trying to claim he has won and hasn't even conceded. That's not an expression of strength. And the way that some voices are now using this opportunity to now go after left-wing elements in their party, like Ocasio-Cortez and others, is particularly shocking. I mean, Donald Trump hasn't even conceded the election yet, and already they're trying to blame Bernie Sanders and say we don't need any democratic socialists anymore. That's certainly alarming, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. I think first and foremost, there's a certain understanding of expectations. I think a lot of people were going in saying, we got a blue wave coming. Even if we were to baseline what polling was this year compared to 2016, the polling was off more this cycle. We were lucky that Joe Biden, looked to have a larger buffer than Hillary Clinton did. But you're absolutely right. The election came down to roughly 100,000 votes between 4 states, and we did not take back the Senate as we were hoping to do, and we lost seats in the House. So you're absolutely right. There is certainly stuff there to be reflected on of, did this model of the safe choice that is going to have coattails really work. I'd love to ask you, in your opinion, obviously there is this misunderstanding a little bit of what the left wing is framed as. And, obviously, I would say you describing yourself as a Marxist is probably a little bit more left wing than even Bernie Sanders would. But could you let the folks out there kind of have an understanding of, how do you define really socialism as a concept as well as Marxism? Because I think that was a really big scare word this cycle. And I think a lot of the fundamentals of what these things are a lot better than what the branding that a lot of people associate with them. Could you clarify how you interpret those concepts?
Sure. Socialism is a system where the banks, factories, the industries, the major centers of economic power are operated for public good, not simply for the profits of private owners. Socialism is when the economy is organized rationally for the good of society, rather than by private owners simply working for profits. Under capitalism, we don't have houses because people need a place to live. We have houses because landlords and bankers need to make money off of them. Under capitalism, we don't have food so people can eat it. We have food so that big box stores and agribusiness can make money from it. Capitalism is a system of production for profit, production for sellability, not production for use. And socialism would be reorganizing the economy in order to serve public good, right? It would be the people of this country taking control of the economy and making it work in the interest of all of us, not in the interest of a wealthy few. I've actually laid out 4 steps that would be a transition towards socialism in the United States. I've said that if the United States were to move towards socialism, I think the first thing would be a massive reconstruction of the country, something that would make Roosevelt's Public Works Administration look almost like child's play, just a huge mobilization of the country to rebuild the crumbling bridges, high-speed railway, new schools, new universities, new water systems, new power plants, every inch of the country having, high access Wi-Fi, just revamping the country with a mass construction effort. That would be step number 1. Step number 2 would be public control of our natural resources. America's oil, America's gas, America's coal, America's timber should belong to all the people of the country. Not simply to big corporations or Wall Street stock owners. They should be public property, and they should be managed. Our natural resources should be managed in a way that is in the long-term benefit of the country, and the profits made from our oil and our gas and our coal should go into the public budget so we can pay for things like schools and hospitals and education, etc. On top of that, I would say that the banking system should be under public ownership, right? That the lending of money should be a monopoly in the hands of the state, and that if somebody wants to get a loan to start a business, they should go to the community and make the case that their business would benefit the community. And if that's the case, then they'll get the loan. And when they pay their loan back, the interest will go into the public budget. So we can, again, have more things that are necessary for the public. That would be step 3, public control of banking. That would be getting rid of the Federal Reserve System, because the Constitution is very clear that only the federal government can print money, not a private corporation like the Federal Reserve. But on top of that, the final step would be to enact Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights and guarantee everyone the right to jobs and housing and education, the things that Roosevelt proposed in his final State of the Union address. If we took those 4 steps, the United States would be very quickly moving towards socialism. That wouldn't be full socialism, but those 4 steps would be a pretty solid transition. I've often raised the slogan in order to put forward what socialism would be in the United States. We need a government of action to fight for working families, right? Because we have this idea in the United States, the government is best that governs least, right? The government should just kind of sit back. Well, Franklin Roosevelt called that do nothing government. And right now across the United States, bridges are crumbling, our schools are crumbling, people don't have what they need. We need a government that swings into action to fight for working families. And we need a government that is strong enough to push back the power of big corporations and take dramatic action to improve the lives of America's working people. And that is my understanding of what 21st century socialism would be like in the United States.
Yeah, so Caleb, I think there's a lot to that is largely appealing, but I think there are certain concerns that can come up because, establishing this concept of public good inherently is a tricky problem to solve. And so, there is the concern that, obviously you're calling for this mass mobilization and the guarantee of jobs. But, does this also mean that the private individuals who are small business owners who want to be working as a stable job, what does that transition look like to them? Because I think for a lot of these people, they want to kind of have a little bit more control over their destiny. And when they hear this concept, they raise potential red flags of some government bureaucrat basically assigning them a job because this is what's for the public good. Can you let us know, what is this decision-making process in your mind to establish a public good? Because I think a lot of Americans are kind of distrustful of government at the moment. You know, we have record like lows in terms of congressional approval rating. How do you factor in a government that we can trust so that it can actually do things for the public good rather than use a jobs program potentially to like build a wall like Trump would want?
Well, here's the thing. I'll answer your question in a couple different ways. The first point that I think needs to be made is that I think that small business owners, restaurants, hotels, things like that would play a very important role in socialism in the United States. I don't think we'll ever have a situation where the government runs the hotels, or the government runs the restaurants, or people aren't able to sell stuff on eBay or have their own YouTube channel and make money or something like that. I would never be in favor of something like that. And if you look at the socialist countries around the world, like China, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like Cuba, they have moved toward having a market sector out of necessity, right? We've learned from the Cold War. The Soviet model, where the government runs absolutely everything, is certainly not going to return. But things like hospitals and healthcare should be under public ownership. It shouldn't be operated for profit. You know, things like our natural resources, things like the lending of money, these things should be operated in a way that average people have a say over how that they're operated, and that can only come through mass participation of the public. And that includes, bringing people into politics, a mobilization of the population, and it can be done. And the problem we have in the United States right now, there's so much unemployment right now, but there's so much work that needs to be done, right? But under capitalism, people only work if a capitalist can make money from their labor, right? So you can have all kinds of work that needs to be done, all across the country. This country is in shambles right now, but it's not being done because a capitalist cannot make profit from it. Well, that's where we need the state to step in and mobilize the public to get these things done and to fight for average people. The problem with the government right now isn't the problem with government in itself. The problem is that we have a government that works for big corporations. We have a very weak government that has just kind of fallen over and rolled over and let big multinational corporations do whatever they want and allowed the country to fall into ruin. And I think that needs to change.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very reasonable point. I think this is a good point for us to take our first break here. I want to come back and start to talk to you about, obviously, as you just even admitted here, there's going to be some level of balance between private and public ownership in some respect. And so I want to flesh that out more, as well as talk about, politically, obviously, there are these goals of what socialism prescribes, but the American consciousness of what it perceives socialism today is kind of skewed from that. And so how do we tactically approach that? So we'll come back in part 2 to talk with Caleb about both of these subjects. Okay, we're here with Caleb Maupin. We're in our second part of our conversation where we are really trying to flesh out the ideas of some of these more left-leaning policies in America that, frankly, I think has had a lot of misconceptions. And I think we will still have some differences in approach. And I think, the first thing we got to understand is we were establishing in part 1 that there's going to be some level of balance between private and public ownership. You mentioned on some of these subjects that you want to have some level of nationalization of resources. My question to you is, why do you believe we need to monopolize compared to just simply have stronger public options and, engagement of the government in general? Do you see some benefit towards that? Because if a private entity were to be doing it more efficiently than the government, would that not be a good outcome to be allowing that to happen?
Well, the issue is efficiently for what? A private entity is going to operate very efficiently to make their own profits, right? But the point of socialism is that the major centers of economic power are organized to serve public good and to work in the benefits of the country overall, not simply to make profits for those who own them, right? And, Marxism talks about a division of classes. There are those of us who own for a living. They own big banks, they own big stores, they own airlines and telecommunications, etc. And then there are those of us who sell our labor, right? They're the working class. We sell our labor in order to survive. And those of us who sell our labor for a living, we are the working class. We are the majority. And socialism is about empowering the working class majority to take hold of the state. Right now, we have a government that works not for the working class, but for the property owners, for the capitalists. And socialism is about having a government that works for the working class and using the state as so that the working class can assert control over the major centers of economic power. And probably the biggest lie, and you hear this if you ever turn on Fox News, if you ever, everywhere you go in the United States, people say that socialism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried. It's never been successful. Well, that is so utterly false. If you look at the historical record, it is astounding. It was socialism that took Russia from being one of the poorest countries in the world to becoming a superpower, to launching the world's first spacecraft, to defeating the Nazis in World War II, to wiping out illiteracy, to electrifying the whole country, to building some of the biggest hydroelectrical power plants in the world. China today, with its state centrally planned economy, 5-year economic plans, and the leadership of the Communist Party, is at this point the second largest economy in the world, 800 million people lifted out of poverty, the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, half the steel in the world is being produced. This lie that we have been spoon-fed our whole lives, that socialism just doesn't work, it's completely and utterly false, right? And we need to get past this. The notion that we can't have the government step in and fight for us. We can't have a state that works for the population overall and stands up and fights against the power of big corporations. That needs to be eroded. Because it's with socialism that many countries around the world have lifted themselves up out of poverty. I always tell people, the greatest example is, I visited Ecuador when I was 12 years old in 1999, and I had never seen so much poverty. That was after Ecuador had adopted free market libertarian policies with the IMF. They had been forced to drop their own currency and adopt the dollar, and they were just wrecked economically by these libertarian, neoliberal free market policies. I went back to Ecuador in 2013 after the Marxist socialist president Rafael Correa had been in there, and I saw a completely different country. I saw a country with new highways and new bridges. I saw a country without really any unemployment. I saw, so much infrastructure had been built. I saw a population that was very proud of their heritage. The streets' names had been changed for the indigenous leaders, which I thought was really, really kind of exciting. And Ecuador was completely transformed. And, Bolivia, until the recent coup, they had the highest rate of GDP growth in South America, where the government of Evo Morales was really carrying out real economic miracles, paved the roads, wiped out illiteracy, provided health care to the country, flying in Cuban doctors and Cuban dentists. Socialism has been a very successful economic system. Have there been problems? Of course, right? Have there been human rights violations? Of course. And that's something that any obviously sane person would want to struggle against. But to say that socialism has been a big failure is just utterly false. And we have been spoon-fed this in the United States. And really, the thing is, Bernie Sanders doesn't advocate anything close to what I'm advocating here. He just wants free college and free healthcare. But you'll notice in every debate, they bring up Stalin and Maduro and Fidel Castro because economic discourse in the United States is predicated on this big lie that capitalism is the only system, because every attempt to go beyond capitalism has only made things worse, only made people poorer. If we don't overcome this big lie, we're not going to be able to fix our economy here in the United States.
So I think the thing that I have to ask, though, in this circumstance is that, one of the things with, seizing any means of production here as a socialist system would require is going to have some form of authoritarianism be required to basically take from one group to another. How do you try to manage the actual system itself so that it's not trying to be this power-hungry system that commits genocides in the meantime? As we've said, there have been civil rights concerns. What is that system? Because obviously the power from one system to another in some approaches ends up being a transfer of power from private to the government compared to being a transfer of power from private to people. And so I want to ask you, when you try to make that shift over time, how do you prevent that from just being another consolidation of power that can be prone to corruption? Because, you know, you can admit that there are benefits that have occurred in these socialist countries, but there are also obviously instances of rank corruption that has happened. And there have also been times where, as you admit, there have been inefficiencies that have happened. How do you try and guide it? Because I think a lot of faith gets put into these authoritarian systems because, you know, we're not at the wheels at the end of the day. Only so many of us are going to be in the government system. What's that system that you're looking for to keep them accountable?
The thing is that the only way socialism could ever come into being in the United States or really in any other country, it has always resulted from a huge democratic upsurge of participation from the population. You know, what does the word Soviet mean, right? It sounds like this scary Russian word. It just means council, right? And it was in the process of bringing down the Tsar, the Russian people formed these councils in their neighborhoods and in their communities, right? And these councils that they formed in the process of their revolution, these community assemblies, became the basis of the Soviet government, the new government, right? You know, in China, you can talk about the peasant associations. I've been to Venezuela and seen the Bolivarian circles, and that socialist movements and socialist governments depend on a huge, well-organized base among the population of people getting involved in politics, people carrying out the agenda of the revolutionary government. And so the idea that some government could just take power in Washington, D.C. and from above just impose these kind of things is not realistic at all, right? I mean, we're talking about some of the wealthiest and most entrenched, powerful interests in the world, not just in the United States, but in the world, right? The only way they could be beaten back was with a mass upsurge of participation in which millions of people are involved in politics and taking history into their own hands. And so that in and of itself would require a huge amount of accountability. When that many people are in motion and taking action, you have a situation where they're not going to accept some leader just imposing problematic policies. But corruption is a problem in any system, right? I mean, let's not pretend there aren't many capitalist countries throughout the developing world that have huge problems with corruption.
I mean, hey, we are the capitalist country right now, and it's plenty corrupt.
Look at Joe Biden's family, for goodness sake. There's plenty of corruption in our system. Hunter Biden.
Yeah, both sides have their corruption for sure.
And that, you constantly, people that want to argue against socialism will give you a body count. They'll say, well, this many people died. Well, what is the body count of capitalism, right? Just to create capitalism. You couldn't have had capitalism without colonialism, and millions of people dying in Africa and South America. And the genocide of the Native Americans and the transatlantic slave trade. There was even genocide in Europe, the clearing of the commons. And how many wars have there been for capitalist profits? You talk about World War I, 20 million workers sent to their deaths, just so the capitalists of France and the capitalists of Germany and the capitalists of Britain could carve up the world for themselves. Capitalism has a huge body count that is far larger than any alleged body count against socialism.
So I think the final question I want to talk about with you, Caleb, is kind of reflecting on the state of kind of the left movement in America. Obviously, as you admitted, you are to the left of someone like Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders in this cycle fell short of being able to secure the nomination, roughly securing, 26% of the popular vote. It seemed like he did a little bit worse this cycle compared to what he was doing in 2016. Do you think there was anything to that? What reflections did you take from his campaign that you want the left movement of America to think about going forward?
Well, I like Bernie Sanders in a lot of ways, but I think that left-wing politics in the United States has a bit of a tone problem. Many people in the United States right now who are losing their jobs, are worried about paying their bills, are not interested in socialism because they see socialism as a destructive mob of people that want to go out and break things, that want to destroy the country and want to make their lives worse. The message of the socialist movement needs to be, we want to make your life better, right? I have often said to people, I'm a socialist not because I want to destroy America, because I want to save America. I want to save America from the horror of greed and imperialism and destruction, right? And that the message needs to be, we will make your life better by getting rid of the rule of profits. We need people to understand that advocates of socialism are the most patriotic people around. We want socialism because we love this country so much. And I think that since the 1960s, left-wing circles have kind of been taken over by, there's a kind of adolescent vibe that you get of people that are very angry at society, angry at their parents, want to go out and break things. That's not real politics. That's emotion. That's catharsis. That is not real politics, right? Socialism is about loving your community, loving your country, opposing any form of imperialism or national chauvinism, any form of racism or bigotry, any form of discrimination or oppression, but loving your country, loving your community, wanting to make a better world and wanting to transform society. And look, the ultimate goal would be, the hope is that eventually there could be so much abundance in society and so much prosperity created that we could move toward a world where the need for things like prisons and cops could fade away gradually based on a vast material abundance, based on an advance of technology, right? The goal is to build a world where there won't be a need for any kind of coercion or repression. And that is the ultimate goal. But the only way that can be done is with a rationally planned economy in which we can get the level of material abundance and prosperity that could lay the basis for moving toward a non-authoritarian world. So we need to understand that at the root of so much politics is economics, right? And that, humanity, we've gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to feudalism. We broke free from feudalism and adopted capitalism. Well, the next stage in human history is going to be a rationally planned, centrally planned socialist economy. And my hope is that that can lead to something even more prosperity and even more egalitarian. So, human beings, we are a species full of creativity and brilliance. We have the ability to do things that other species don't do. Ants have been building their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. Beavers have been building their beaver dams for thousands of years the exact same way. But in the last thousands of years, human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones. We are a creative species, and we will continue to advance.
Yeah, I think that evolution of man concept and the adaptability of man is a very well put. That very well put point. But, I wanted to ask you just a point of clarification, because I thought this was very interesting, kind of how you said the kind of aggression and adolescence kind of vibe that the left has given. Obviously, there is some truth in the adolescence, mainly because that is where the popularity of the movement is held. But I'd love for you to speak on, there has certainly been this more aggressive, almost completely not anti-American in terms of being like having bad values, but they literally espouse that they want like the destruction of America so that it could be reborn in a new kind of socialist image. Could you explain why you think the left kind of needs to be a little bit less aggressive in its messaging? Because I think this has been a large divide in the left in general. We feel like we're this constant, circular firing squad.
Indeed. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of the way left-wing aesthetics has kind of evolved in a way that it's kind of giving people permission to release their aggression and release their anger and release their impulses. And that's deeply problematic. And that at the end of the day, socialism is a constructive ideology. It's not a destructive ideology. It may have anger at the old system and the old order, but the goal is not chaos. The goal is a society that's much more rationally and centrally organized, right? I mean, socialism is a society where the means of production are organized to serve public goods, not profits. That's more order, not more chaos. But unfortunately, I think that, there's been a long process, during the Cold War, Marxism, Leninism was the main opposition to the United States around the world. There was the Soviet Union and such, and there was a covert effort. You can read about the CIA's program they call the Congress for Cultural Freedom. You can read about Zbigniew Brzezinski and his efforts during the administration of Jimmy Carter and before and afterwards to manipulate left-wing politics. We had the rise of something called the New Left. And the New Left was very much a deviation from Marxism. And in a lot of ways, the New Left believes in the opposite of what I believe, right? I believe human beings will advance and we will get to a higher stage. Many on the New Left argue, well, we've gone too far. We need to go back to nature, right? And that human beings are a cancer on the earth. We are having too many children, and that there is a very strange kind of primitivist, destructive current that has taken hold of left-wing politics. And this was covertly supported by our government in an effort to kind of maneuver against the influence of the Soviet Union and China and communists in left-wing circles. And it started out with the funding of, artistic galleries and music, and it maneuvered into a whole different direction. And that's why it gets very confusing. What does it mean to be a leftist in our time? What does it mean to be a conservative in our time? Well, the words left and right originated during the French Revolution. And it was after, the king was overthrown. They formed a National Assembly, and those who were conservative and wanted to, uphold feudalism, they sat on the right. But those who wanted to march into the future toward a more democratic and more egalitarian France, they sat on the left. Leftism is associated with historical progress and moving ahead. And I think that genuine leftist politics has always been that way, and that there is kind of a destructive current that has a lot of influence now, and that's deeply problematic.
Yeah, I genuinely agree with you. We do need to focus a lot more on the constructive elements, and I do think it is, maybe it's a framing for a mainstream audience where it's not as much, going left as it is forward, as that's kind of what you are kind of prescribing here. It's just the advancement of society. So, Caleb, I want to turn over the floor to you. Is there anything that you want the audience out there to go check out that either you have going on or that you just want them to go learn about it in general?
Well, I'm live on YouTube all the time. You can watch my broadcasts. I take people's questions. I update people on current events. That's on my YouTube channel, Caleb Maupin. But I've also published a number of books on this topic. Probably the book that I wrote that is the most popular is a book called City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, which is very much about the question of socialism, talking about what happened in the 20th century, talking about the progressive tradition and how socialist politics have been distorted. I also recently wrote a book about Kamala Harris and examined the vice president-elect, her political roots, where she came from, and used her as kind of an example of how American politics has evolved in our time and where we can go from here in the era of Trump versus Biden. So people should check out my published writings or check out my work on YouTube. My website is calebmaupin.com. That's CALEBMAUPIN. And I encourage people to engage with what I have to say. And I thank you, John, for bringing me on. I do appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Caleb. So I got to pick your brain, as you just had Kamala on the mind. Do you think she is going to take over before 2024? Do you think she is going to be the clear nominee for 2024?
I think there's a very good chance that Joe Biden, being 82 years old and being, the oldest president we've ever had, may retire pretty soon. And Kamala Harris will be our next president. And I think that that's very unfortunate, because the American people heard what Tulsi Gabbard said about her on the debate stage and her record as a prosecutor. And the American people largely rejected her at the polls. But she has made a deal with a certain faction that was in with the Hillary Clinton State Department that has a lot of influence in Silicon Valley. And even though the American people rejected her at the polls, she was maneuvered into being the vice presidential nominee. And as a result of that, she's likely to be our president very soon.
Yeah, I unfortunately largely agree with you. So, Caleb, again, it was a pleasure being able to have you on today. Thank you so much for trying to bring some clarification to these, very complicated labeling sometimes. So thank you so much for stopping by. Come back again soon.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Well, everyone out there, I hope you all are having a great day, everyone. And I hope, as always, that you guys are staying rosy out there. Thank you so much for watching today's episode of The Hill of Roses. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, please let us know by subscribing to our channel, liking today's video, and sharing the video with your friends. Also, if you want to be notified, please make sure you hit the bell when you subscribe. Finally, if you want to find more of our network's content, please go to thehillofroses.com. With that being said, we love y'all for helping the movement grow, and we hope you're staying rosy out there.